Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Understanding and Finding Savings in Utility Bill Data. My name is Maureen Shires. Today's presentation will discuss why you should consider utility bill data as mission critical to your business. We will highlight trends in the marketplace, and we will also do a deep dive on utility bill errors, all in an effort to provide you with insight and understanding on utility bill data. Today's webinar is hosted by UtiliSave. Since 1991, UtiliSave has been a leading optimizer and auditor of utility bill data for large energy consumers. We review utility data with in-depth analysis, resulting in recovery, savings, and refunds while increasing operational efficiency. Through deep dive audits using expert auditors and utility specialists, our proprietary software and innovative methodology, we deliver larger net returns, decrease net operating expense, and improve our customers' bottom line. So why do we think utility bill data is mission critical to your bottom line success? Well, did you know that utilities make up about 20% of your overall operating costs, and that up to 79% of utility bills will have some sort of error? Were you aware that errors and inefficiency negatively impact your net profit, putting a drag on your income? Here's a cool factoid, and it's quite amazing. A $1 reduction in annual utility costs can turn into $20 of capital value. And if savings is not important to you, perhaps it's the integrity of your data. Incorrect data negatively impacts any data analysis. And finally, resolving billing and data errors helps to identify operational inefficiencies, so you can isolate incidences of energy wastefulness. So what's happening in the marketplace right now in utility bill data? Well, a whopping 85% of energy managers have indicated that improving the collection of energy data will help them meet their goals this year. And as we stated earlier, utility expenses is one of the biggest monthly operating costs. Finance departments need accurate utility data to properly plan. And 79% of energy managers view utility bill cost reduction as fundamental in providing them a competitive edge in the marketplace today. This webinar is focused on utility bill data that is mission critical. We will provide you insights for data and billing validation. We will discuss the importance of benchmarking, and finally, uncovering energy wastefulness. I would like to now introduce you to Michael Steifman, CEO of UtiliSave. He will provide you that deeper dive on data for this webinar. Michael, more thoughts on data?
Continuing on, the data that we're focused on relates to tariff issues, taxes, surcharges, meter reads, data aberrations, weather effects, meter malfunctions, the rates, whether they're regulated or deregulated, occupancy, and all different types of proceedings that are going on in the regulatory bodies, principal the Public Service Commission. Rules are constantly changing. Bills are constantly being issued. Portfolios are being modified. And everyone is trying to become smarter, especially the people here as we try to deliver greater results for our customers. That mix of all those events leads to constant ability to uncover opportunities. So when we think about auditing bills, we focus on an 8-step process. It starts with the client providing information, and this is relevant whether you're doing this in-house or with an outside professional. Then taking that initial account data and going out and securing long-term historical data, usually up to 6 years worth of data. Undertaking the audit, which begins by analyzing that data and then applying a whole knowledge set against that data. Undertaking site inspections, And then with the combination of the data, the internal analysis, and the site information that's gathered, submitting and beginning a process to adjudicate issues with utility companies. Delivering results. The results can be either obviously positive or negative. If they're positive, then you can deliver a final result. And if they're negative, we ascertain whether there's something still to be contested or whether the issue is moot. Obtaining the savings and delivering it to the customers, and then continuing with that process again. We view the whole process of auditing bills as a continuous process. Every month we're collecting data, and we're running algorithms against that data looking for opportunities. So there's a constant monthly approach to focusing on the data and the opportunities. Ideas are written in algorithms, and every time an algorithm delivers an instance where there's a possible opportunity and an exception report is issued, and then each of those exception reports are vetted until there's either an opportunity delivered or the idea is ruled as being not valid. And then oftentimes that'll be an impetus for going back to looking at the algorithms to try to improve the algorithms to deliver less false positives. And then there's a manual process that happens anywhere from every 2 to 3 months to as to once a year, depending on the nature of the account. So between automated processes, which there's a constant endeavor to create more of those, and manual processes to cover ideas which can't be automated yet, there's a never-ending process of reviewing and auditing the bills. The effect of that is that we are delivering for clients constant refunds and savings throughout the year. People who have been doing this for 15, 20 years running can experience savings of $500,000, $100,000, $300,000, $1 million a year consistently, all through different issues, for different properties, for different times. It's quite extensive and quite exhaustive, and I think highlights the whole concept of being mission critical. Building a staff to undertake this type of forensic auditing is based on having a skilled staff that has deep knowledge of the tariffs, the rules, the regulations, the taxes, contracts. We have attorneys on staff. We have outside attorneys on staff. We have engineers on staff and on retainer as well. This is a real hunter-gathering type of approach, looking at tariffs, at rules, and figuring out how they can be more effectively applied to the benefit of a particular type of building or customer. And then the challenges are just really beginning, even though that's quite challenging in and of itself, because then it's about going to the utility company and getting them to accept a position that you've adapted. And that requires a real proficiency in negotiating. We can be right all day, but if we can't convince the utility company of our position, we've really not accomplished very much. So it all starts with a very basic premise, which probably seems obvious. I think it'll seem a bit more impactful when I finish with my brief demonstration here. If your data isn't accurate, your analysis isn't going to be accurate. So here's a real example. All the examples that I'm using today in case studies or in any of the charts are actual customers and their data to illustrate real-world examples of what we've been able to focus on and uncover. So this is a hospital, and this is 12 months of data. This was as originally billed. This next slide takes that same data and weather adjusts it. So there are many factors that affect how much energy you use. Weather is the most primary. I can show you buildings, and this part is just an example, order of magnitude example. I can show you a building that in 1 year used $700,000 of electric, and in the next year used $1 million of electric. And I'd ask you, which one do you think was more efficient? And the most natural answer would be the one that spent $700,000. But that could be false. The one that has the year of $1 million in charges for that same building could have been a summer that was extremely hot, maybe the hottest ever, and a winter that was extremely cold, maybe the coldest ever. While the year where the building was $700,000 could have been the mildest of summers and winters, so that the infrastructure, the heating and cooling, the HVAC, had to be rarely or minimally used, so that in actuality, even though the bill was larger, the efficiency of the building, the minimized use occurred in the year that you spent $1 million. So when you take weather out of the equation, the numbers can change radically. So here you can see the effect of weather in each of these years when adjusted. So we use 2014 weather to adjust the 2015 year of data. We can use many different years, and there's reasons to use different years versus other years, which we won't cover in this discussion, but we can do that another time perhaps if there's interest. We'd love to hear, as well as any questions in my presentation. Any suggestions on future topics of discussion are welcome as well. So you'll notice here that not only does every month change, but actually in some months the weather-adjusted data is less than the non-weather adjusted, and in some months it's more. That is an interesting phenomenon that also has many reasons, which we'll cover another time. But the point to make is adjusting for weather has an effect on all the data, almost always. The weather would have to be exactly the same every single day, every hour of the day, which obviously doesn't happen. So taking weather out of the equation to look at a weather normalized information, and there are other things that you can normalize for as well, but weather is the most significant, the most readily available, and on a weight factor, probably it's 50 to 60% of the weighting of the normalization factors that you would use. Here's the effect of that. So you can see it's quite material, and again, goes up and down depending on what happened in each month. Next, we take the data and we look at the weather-adjusted 2015 data based on 2014 and the actual 2014 data. So now we have the raw data for 2015, 2015 based on 2014, and 2014. And here again you'll see that the 15 data adjusted to 2014 weather and the 2014 actual data vary. So the data isn't consistent for the same building even when the weather is taken out, and that starts to make this data a bit more interesting. We looked at the 2015 data and we found an error. And the error that we found was in this month here. It's circled. Obviously, it looks a bit odd to begin with because it's so high, but it was in August. Could have been a very hot August. I'd say that for all the errors that we find like this, we could have instances where the graphs look quite similar and there isn't any error. So it isn't just about finding the odd outlier. It's about much more than that. And especially when an outlier like this happens in August, it's easy to rationalize away that it was just related to it being in the heart of the summer. In any case, this adjustment, this error as reflected here, when we took the 2015 data and the weather-adjusted data on 2015 before the adjustment on the bill was made, it showed that the weather-adjusted number, the 2015 weather-adjusted for 2014, had a consumption of 3.8 million kilowatt hours, kWh. When we took the adjusted billing, the weather-adjusted information for the usage that year and that month was 3.5 million. So $300,000 difference in consumption for that 1 month. And here's where it all sort of ties together. When we take the information, adjusted and unadjusted, and run them side by side. So what this is representing is the purple line here is the information that was recorded and would have been submitted to Energy Star before there was a billing adjustment. The gray bar is the information after the billing adjustment. You'll notice that in every month of this year, based on there just being 1 month in that August month of data being incorrect because of a billing error, every single month the data changes. And again, it isn't in one direction. It isn't one directional. In some months, the gray, as a result, is slightly larger or materially larger than the purple. But in other months, the purple remains much larger than the gray. So every month changes as a result of 1 month's data as data reported because of that one billing error. And the direction of the data is not one directional. Now, this is something that I uncovered when I was preparing to give a talk on benchmarking. And I think it highlights the importance of the integrity of your data, because something like this would affect your Energy Star score. Something like this would reflect any other kind of public reporting you might do in Sarbanes-Oxley or any other kind of environmental or sustainability report. So I thought this was a very clear and stark example to present to you to illustrate how data and its integrity can matter in more ways than you might anticipate. Let's talk now about billing validation. So bills come every month. They come in rapid succession. It is very hard to stay on top of tracking each of these bills. There could be 100 points. This is just the front page of a bill. And there's usually 2 or 3 pages after that. And besides all the data that might be presented in those 2 or 3 pages, there's more data even behind those calculations. So all told, there's about 100 points in a typical bill that would need to be validated if you were going to validate every aspect of a bill. Clearly, unless you have a dedicated staff, either in-house or out-of-house, there isn't enough time in the day to do that and collect all the data that's relevant and run all the analysis in light of all the other things that need to get done in a day. So I want to talk to you about a few case studies. So in this example, this building has 4 meters. They're represented by the 4 lines at the bottom, each in their own color. There's also a totalizer that aggregates the demand. These are demand readings. And you can see that at the very peak here, where the gray line runs horizontally, is where the peak demand should have occurred. The actual billing occurred at the orange line. Now, utilities do not give you the information in this kind of stylized manner, and it would be very much a task to uncover the data in a way that uncovered this kind of error. But when it's laid out in the manner as shown here, it becomes quite stark and obvious. So this 1 month bill, this differential of the demand, was worth $23,000. This is 1 month's bill based on probably an error of one piece of data. You can see how the demand reading drops here and isn't properly recorded, and we'll talk more about missing data. And this probably had some effect on what the ultimate number was. Next, I want to focus for a minute or two on a rate change. So a lot of what we do is focusing on optimizing the tariff, finding a tariff that is better for you. Typically, that isn't as obvious as you would like it, meaning it isn't like this tariff says you pay 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and this tariff says you pay 8 cents a kilowatt hour. So of course you want to try to get the tariff that has 8 cents a kilowatt hour. Tariffs are generally complex, have multiple periods of time, a shoulder, a peak, an off-peak, and sometimes have others, can treat demand in multiple fashions with a ratcheted demand, a peak demand, an annual peak demand. There are a myriad of ways these things are priced and structured by the utility companies. At the end of the day, and prices fluctuating for the time of use, prices fluctuating for the season, prices fluctuating based on different ratchets of where you are in your consumption. The typical situation is, besides it being a complex calculation, it isn't always, even when properly undertaken, one where there's a savings every single month. And that can be the scary part. So in this example, we start off with a rate that is beneficial. The blue line is the new rate. The red line is the old rate. And you can see for this period here up till this point, there's clear savings. It starts to converge, but there are clear savings under the new rate. And then the lines cross, and that's where the trouble begins. And now the new rate is more expensive than the old rate. And that would typically cause someone who was trying to monitor a rate change to panic that maybe he'd made a mistake. Knowledge of understanding how the rates can ebb and flow and be positive or negative, and understanding the true final outcome, is key to understanding where the opportunities lie. So even though this had savings and then a diminution of savings, or a application of the savings to cover an increase in costs, it ultimately ended up being beneficial to the tune of about $30,000. Managing that whole process, making sure that things come off as planned, is a key part of managing a successful rate change. So in the third example, often what we're doing is finding the needle in the haystack. This is another iteration of the data example I showed you, where 1 month's data had such a material effect on 12 months of reported data in Energy Star. So this needle in the haystack looks quite obvious when presented in this kind of format, but rarely ever is it presented in such a format that's easy to find. Another focus of ours is on unit costs. So we track thousands of buildings, it's about 16,000 buildings, and we derive a max unit cost for different utility types in different jurisdictions. And then we check to see how those compare, how that compares to the prices of individual customers. So we have a nice statistically significant pool of data to draw from. And when we see an outlier like the one demonstrated here, it raises some doubts, raises some questions. Now, I would tell you that there are many reasons why this outlier could happen, including, as I've said before, there'd be no reason other than it's a valid bill. There are reasons why, based on the price, that this outlier is not an outlier, but is a correct outlier. But that said, there can also be other reasons why there is an error here. It could be that the bill demand was erroneous, or the wrong rate was utilized, or the wrong service class was utilized, or there was an improper interpretation of the ESCO contracts. We are often seeing today that as the ESCOs try to be more competitive with utility companies and try to be more competitive with themselves, with each other, they are writing more and more esoteric rates. As a fact, we had recently a client that had the most complicated, it had about, I'd say, 12 factors that changed monthly that affected how the bill was calculated against a benchmarked standard. And it was so complicated, it took us probably 100 man-hours to figure out. And we found about $250,000 error in that adjustment. And I think it was so complicated to figure out that the utility company just agreed with us because it would have taken them more time to recalculate it themselves. So this growth of more complicated algorithms used to define a billing price has, in our experience, only led to more billing errors because the computer systems or the computer programming doesn't seem, in the billing program, in the billing department, doesn't seem to be able to keep up with the more novel ways that the sales department can write these contracts. So now we're going to talk about missing data. This is a really interesting and exciting area that we have focused a lot of attention on and continue to focus a lot more attention on. There is a tremendous move towards interval data. Principally today, any large building of consequence, and we'll say that's a building of at least 300,000 square feet. In many jurisdictions, it could be buildings as little as 50,000 square feet. In some utilities, it's every building. But certainly any large building today has an interval meter. It is pretty much ubiquitous. In those meters, data is being collected every 15 minutes. There's now utilities that do it every 5 minutes. It ultimately might be every few seconds. The more granular the data generally, the more opportunistic that information serves, and a lot more can be discerned from it. But typically today, utility companies are using 15-minute data. This is a real, hard to believe, but a real illustration of how much data was missing in 1 month in a bill. The utility company presented this bill and claimed that the demand was 7,500, a little bit less than 7,600. Using our analysis techniques, we were able to demonstrate that a more reasonable demand, obviously you don't know what the true demand is because there's so much data missing here, but a more reasonable demand was about 6,700 kW. That's a huge difference of nearly 1,000 kW or 15%. And the value to the customer is $20,000, which is not a small amount, but this happens daily. Not necessarily to this degree, but happens daily. Data is missing all the time. In the course of a month, a meter like this is collecting 3,000 data points. In an instance where even 1% or 2%, up to 2% generally, is an acceptable amount of data loss. And the utility companies have an approved methodology to fill in the data. That's very down and dirty and simplistic. And it's not because they're trying to harm their customers. As a matter of fact, sometimes these methodologies are more beneficial to the customer. But at the end of the day, they're looking for a simple way to fill in the data to issue the bills, because from the moment that they collect this data till they have to issue the bill could be as little as 2 days, maybe they have 3 or 4 days. So they need something simplistic. That doesn't mean that it's optimal. And we have developed a tremendous insight into how to discern which data has been estimated. They don't tell you. They don't tell you, here are the 30 data points that we filled in. They just fill them in and they bill. And this has been a really interesting and insightful mechanism and methodology that we've developed to uncover where those opportunities are and when they can be optimized. Just to put it in a sort of broader scale perspective, this is the same client's interval data for 24 months, and it's very hard to, in a graph, display all that data. But what you can see if you look carefully is these areas of large gaps of data, and you can sort of see it throughout. And you can see it all the way through here. There's these little gaps of information. Okay, and there may be just a few pieces of data, and they may actually be insignificant. But I can tell you that in the course of 24 months, to have 1 or 2 incidences where they are significant would be not uncommon. Obviously, finding those instances, understanding where they are, what exactly is inaccurate, whether that inaccuracy is to your benefit, because as I've said, it isn't always to your benefit. This isn't intentional. This is just an outcome of a process that's necessary for the utility companies to adapt. So another area of focus I want to get to is deregulated energy on the whole. So there is this conception that we have found among customers that buying from a deregulated supplier has got to be cheaper and better than buying it from a incumbent utility company. Now that could be the case. We're not saying it isn't ever the case, but it isn't always the case. Here's an example of a client that was purchasing under a fixed price contract energy from an ESCO, and at the end of the day paid 25% more than he would have paid had he stayed on the incumbent utilities variable rate contract. Now, the point of sharing this graph with you isn't to say that fixed contracts are always worse than variable contracts, or buying from an ESCO is not as good as buying from an incumbent utility company. The point is to say that there's no one answer at all times, and one of the most important things to do is to track what the real history is. We have seen among our clients not a strong interest in tracking what actually had happened. When we did a study in 2011, 2012, into the beginning of 2013, we approached our customers as we saw these kinds of instances, and most of them were surprised. Most of them did not go back and analyze whether they actually saved money from one methodology to the other. And again, you could be on a variable utility company and that wouldn't be better. There's generally a big premium being paid for budget certainty, and one that I don't know everyone has analyzed fully and accepts as a worthwhile cost. But at the end of the day, knowing which one has served you well so that you can form your strategy on an ongoing basis is what we're advocating. So we undertake the analysis to see what the true benefit or cost was so that you can be better served in making those decisions going forward. So one of many other ways to look at the utility data is a concept that we call retro-verify. Basically, most office buildings have a master meter, and part, if not all of their buildings' tenants have sub-meters, and they're being billed through that master meter. Generally, the industry average is that 80 to 90% of the energy in a building should be recouped from the sub-metering. In this particular example, again, these are all real-world examples, real customer examples. An average of only 58% was being recouped. Now, that doesn't answer why. It just shows you that there's something less than ideal happening here. It takes a lot of work to uncover the why, and the why in this place was because of wiring deficiencies and errors in the sub-meter data. So oftentimes, sub-meters are installed and forgotten about and used for billing and never changed. That does not generally work to the benefit of the landlord. But it could work either way. The next element is there's a company that's doing this billing. It's recouping a lot of money for you, and you're generally operating blind as to the accuracy of how they're doing their billing. So staying on top of the meters themselves, on how the billing is being done, what other rights you have to cover more costs or increase the way you charge for the electricity under the Public Service Commission rules, under your leases, is all very relevant, and one that requires a diligence that sometimes can fall through the cracks even with operations that work very diligently to be on top of all these matters. So an area of focus that warrants attention on an ongoing basis. So benchmarking as a concept, most of you should be aware of Energy Star. It's a product that was developed by the EPA and is available for anyone to go onto and load information on your building's consumption to derive an Energy Star score. The scores run from 0 to 100. It's all on a curve so that everyone falls within that scale. You're doing better than someone else means someone else's score gets moved down a bit. The idea is it should be a starting point of if you don't measure it, you really can't know if you're doing better. This simplistic illustration is just to highlight improved and deficient benchmarking. There are companies that are very serious about what their scores are. In about 14 cities today, it's mandatory based on a building size to undertake the benchmarking and load your information under Energy Star. And if you don't comply, you could be charged with a penalty, could be many thousands of dollars a year. So there's many times a mandatory requirement to do this. We have many clients that do this regardless of the requirement in a particular jurisdiction to submit this information, just as a means of measuring themselves across their portfolio and across their peers. So I'm going to finish up with a few graphs that I'll run through quite quickly, just to, again, I think that concepts can make sense to you mentally, intellectually, but when you see it in numbers and displayed in graphs, it becomes that much more easier to see. So these are two identical buildings in every which way: size, composition of materials, type of occupancy. One is scattered all over the place, and the other is nice and tight and low to the ground, which is where you want to be. So two buildings exactly the same occupancy, same general hours of operation, and you can see how when it's properly run, when it's properly focused on, when everything is sort of hitting on the head, hitting the nails on the head, how the information displays in a more organized and appropriate type of form. Here's another form of a similar type of information where this is the week information, this is the weekend and holidays information. Everything should be aligned. There should be a consistency, as it is here, of on the weekends and the holidays the consumption is fairly consistent, and then during the week it's running in this bell curve, which this one is as well, but you'll notice that this one has a much higher usage of kilowatt hours per square, per square foot, per square meter, per square foot, again. So it's going as high as 80 kWh, whereas this one is only going up to about 50-something, 55, 56. Again, being low to the ground and being tighter makes this a better profile, one that you'd want to emulate. So I spoke about being able to spot operational inefficiencies from the same data sets. So this is a product that we happen to have developed. There are others, companies that have similar products. What we've done here is we take the interval meter data and we lay it out in a time series. And that's represented by the blue line. So the blue lines here are your actual energy consumption. And then we take an algorithm that's quite extensive that takes that data, pulls it apart, and does a bunch of analysis on it, and then reassembles it and displays it as the brown line. And the brown line is our estimate, our predictive estimate of what you should have been using based on factors of weather, which is displayed here at the bottom, and based on historical factors of the building itself. And the premise here is that when the blue line, like it is here, is higher than the brown line, energy has been used inefficiently. And when conversely, the blue line is less than the brown line, the buildings have been more efficient than anticipated, which is a good thing. And no less requires examination as to why, but certainly isn't something that would cause any complaint. It's when the blue line is above the brown line that there should be some concern. And you can notice here that generally there's a little bit of an aberration here. There's a material one over here. The lines pretty much follow in sync, so the model is showing that there can be some aberrations, but they aren't great, but they still warrant address. You can see here on the weekends the variation is more pronounced, and that means that in these weekends either things were happening that were sanctioned or things were happening that may have been the result of people leaving equipment on, lights on, people coming in at unexpected hours, maybe one person coming in and turning on a whole cooling system for that one person. The point of this is to illustrate incidences and for a building engineer, for a building manager to go back and try to ascertain what caused these things, what caused these spikes, in an effort to better modulate the operation of the buildings, people's behavior, the equipment. These changes, these spikes could be attributable to unmodulated equipment, equipment that has to be serviced, has to be maintained. It could be a myriad of reasons, but to have this record and the ability to go back and look at it and try to discern what happened, especially if you hopefully are keeping logs of different activities of when major pieces of machinery are running, can be very insightful and helpful over time to modify behavior, which is really the biggest key to becoming more energy efficient, is modifying people's behavior, which is exceedingly hard, but there really isn't much of a way around that in practicality without incurring tremendous expense and probably less certain results. So this is just a graph again, and we're just about done, illustrating again the peak points at which there's a inefficiency of use based on a bunch of algorithms of focus on what the energy use is. So highlighting these things in graphical format can be very, very instructive. Here we took an element of the use audit and we try to quantify what the cost was. So in this example, this peak demand for this customer was costing the customer almost $14,000 in demand charges for that month. So that's material. No matter how big or rich your buildings are, $14,000 for wasted energy is something you want to very much avoid. And in this example, the inefficiency was worth a similar amount of about $14,900. So these occurrences can happen in a very brief period of time of an hour or two, but can increase your costs as a percentage by 5, 10, 15%. So a little bit more diligence can make a big difference on impacting on the dollars, and we talked about the sort of follow-on effect of those dollars being saved. So why do these things happen? They happen because there's a lot going on in a building, and it's hard to track everything. That's just a practical answer, which is why the most effective ways of dealing with this is trying to get people to adapt a behavior, a discipline, a focus of keeping an eye on all these different factors, whether it's the building management itself or it's the occupants. Again, a lot of work, but can produce some very real results. And it's just a lack of time to collect all the data and analyze it and focus on it. And one of our attempts in that product that we showed, which we actually just share with our clients for no charge, is to give them information that could be helpful to them and sort of delivers a summary and a focused answer so that they don't have to spend more time doing analysis. They can just try to affect that information into some action item within their operation. So in summary, when you have great data, you can do a lot of great things. You can reduce your energy and operating costs, reduce your maintenance costs. Equipment will last longer. That's known to anyone who's in the operational side of buildings that equipment that doesn't have to work as many hours, it doesn't have to go on and off or vary in frequency of use as much, will have a longer life, will be easier and simpler and less costly to maintain, will improve its performance. You'll have better building conditions of comfort where you don't have erratic changes of equipment going on, fans and exchangers going on and off erratically. And at the end of the day, you'll have a much happier occupant, whether it's an office building or a hospital or a hotel. Fewer calls, fewer efforts spent on correcting these erratic types of activities. So that concludes my presentation. I'm going to...
Yeah, we'd like to open it up for Q&A. Just a reminder to everyone, you can ask questions through the chat, which is located on the left-hand side of your screen. We do have some questions that I want to get to. So let me read one of the questions that came through. What percentage of the time are utility bills actually incorrect?
You know, from our perspective, never often enough. But on the whole, we see errors in about, talking now about the bills, about 10% of the time. That's a good rough number. The errors could be from a very small amount to a very large amount. On the whole, we find that everyone has errors, just a question of how many there are.
Okay, great. Let me see another question that came through. What happens if utility companies decline the adjustment? What options does the company have?
So one of the things that we pride ourselves on is our tenacity in following up and pursuing issues that we think are valid. As I said, in that whole process of collecting the data, analyzing it, and then approaching utility companies with opportunities, not every one of them gets accepted. I'd say that our acceptance rate hovers around 70%. So when we submit an issue, for every 10 that we submit, 7 generally get accepted without a more involved discussion. For the other 30%, I'd say about half ultimately get accepted, and half we decide aren't real issues, that for some reason, whether the utility company caught that error that we spotted before it was reflected in the records and changed it, or our concept was incorrect. But for that other 15%, the effort that we put into it can range from making an appeal to following up with a post-appeal to actually going in front of the Public Service Commission or some other body that's relevant to the particular utility. It isn't always the Public Service Commission, to actually filing a lawsuit in the courts to adjudicate this matter, which we've done many times, almost always with success of getting an adjustment, either by settlement or actually winning a decision. So there's a lot, the road is quite long, and the opportunity to come back and focus on an opportunity, even if it's rejected, has many opportunities, so long as there's a conviction that there's really an opportunity there. We pride ourselves in fighting until the end. Again, in our business model, we are carrying all the costs until we deliver an end result. So if we're going and we're litigating a matter, and we might spend a couple $100,000 in legal fees, that evidence is a great amount of belief and trust in that issue, because we're putting our own money at risk and only get rewarded if we deliver a result to the customer, as is always the case. But with that additional further third-party investment, that shows an even greater conviction to that idea.
Thanks, Michael. I just want to point out to everyone that I did progress the screen so that you could gather Michael's contact information. We do have 2 more additional questions, but I do want to make sure that everyone does capture Michael's email and phone number in case you want to contact him after this event. So one of the questions that came up is in reference to if you can review water meters readings errors that indicate air bubbles and not just water.
So I believe that the writer of that question is talking about this concept that there's air that gets inside the water and somehow creates a false reading. So basically, the meter will show that you used 100,000 cubic feet of water, but there's an element of air, so that you really didn't use 100, you used 90 or 95 or whatever the number is. So there are a number of companies that claim that that happens, and they claim to have a device that can be installed to remove the air and prevent that from happening. There isn't a single utility company that I know of that sanctions or allows the installation of such a device. That may be, part of a conspiracy theory. So actually using these devices can be problematic for most utility companies if they find out that you've installed them. Oftentimes they'll give you some kind of penalty, even if you do it after, because you generally have to do it before the meter, and that could affect the meter's reading. We've seen an instance where they made a claim that this was, causing the meter to malfunction, not necessarily record less, but not record properly. We have spent some time investigating these claims, and we have not found, I'm not saying that they aren't accurate, but we have never found instances where that is the case. I will tell you, just talking about meters, that we often have cases where customers come to us and say, I know my bill is wrong, the meter is really old, something is not working right. And I will tell you a little known secret if you don't know this already. Old water meters only function one way, slow. So if you have a 30-year-old meter, be happy, because you're being undercharged. And utility companies generally today are trying to replace meters every 5 years, 7 years, because they know that a 30-year-old meter could be underbilling you by 10, 20, 30%. So old meters are to your benefit. We've had customers go and replace meters, and they can be quite expensive. If you have a 6-inch meter, to replace a 6-inch meter in New York City could cost you $25,000, and then find out that the bills went up, and that just pisses them off even more. So there are these questions. We haven't validated them ourselves. If any of our listeners have any information on the contrary, I'd love to receive that information and happy to review it as well. But I haven't yet seen any concrete evidence of that.
Nice little piece of info there, Mike. Thanks. We have time for one last question. In-demand billing by utilities where there's missing data. Can we really expect to get refunds from the utilities, especially since the gaps are presently filled with an approved, quote-unquote, approved formula by the utility companies?
So, as I said, that even though the utility companies have filled in the data, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an error to your detriment. I mean, we are not engaged by the utility companies, so we don't act on these. And I'm not just talking now about data errors, but there are many errors that utility companies make that result in their underbilling you. We just notify the customer of those instances and do nothing about them. So there isn't a conspiracy here. The utility companies aren't trying to hurt you, but there are processes that occur, like this data problem where they fill in the data, that could hurt you. So missing data isn't necessarily a negative for you. We pride ourselves on being able to uncover when that happens and then to analyze whether it's been beneficial or detrimental, and when it's detrimental to you, to make a case. But again, it isn't always detrimental. It could also be beneficial.
Okay. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today for our webinar. We will be sending out, to everyone that joined, we will be sending out a link to be able to review the webinar one more time or to share with someone else on your team. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and have a great day.